The word Viking is immensely frustrating. Our grasp on the original etymology is tenuous at best, and Viking was barely even used to label the people who went out to sea. The Europeans on the receiving end of these spontaneous blade-wielding visitors called them Northmen, Danes, Rus, or simply those jerks who trashed our monastery. And the Scandinavians behind this violent tourism didn't really tell us what they called themselves, because our first good records from them don't show up until centuries later. But history is 20% iffy nomenclature by mass, and the name has since stuck. Still though, even our modern usage is problematic, because the term often gets applied as a catch-all for medieval Scandinavia when its meaning is rather narrow. Viking is the act and associated profession of raiding, just being a pirate. Vikings themselves were a small subset of Scandinavians, but their historical impact and overwhelming cool factor earned them top billing in medieval history. So although Scandinavian does not by default equal Viking, we can describe their collective ventures under the banner of the Viking Age. To find out how it all went down and to see just how ludicrously far these Norse boys got, let's do some history. In addition to a wibbly moniker, the Vikings are also a little fuzzy in the timeline department. For narrative convenience, historians often date the age from 793 to 1066, opening with the sack of Lindisfarne Monastery and closing with the Norman conquest of England. But if Vikings are pirates, then their age should be thorough in its coverage of involuntary treasury allocation. So really, we need to bump those numbers out by at least a few decades. Scandinavians were trading, seafaring, and occasionally plundering long before Lindisfarne. It's always tempting to imagine a culture just kind of appearing onto history as a fully formed entity, but Scandinavia had several Viking traits from early on, and the society gradually evolved through the first millennium AD. Trade networks in the Iron Age reached into the Celtic and Roman worlds, and the maritime culture was already fairly robust. Scandinavia was a tough place to traverse, as inland areas were either full of trees or covered in mountains, so people and supplies had to travel by water if they wanted to get anywhere. Luckily, these guys had trees for days, so they became wizards at woodworking and shipbuilding. With the convenient training zone of the enclosed Baltic Sea, Scandinavians developed a truly brilliant ship design, using an overlapping plank construction on a long, narrow, and shallow hull. This meant that ships could sail the open sea and row along rivers, which, to the delight of Scandinavians and the abject terror of Europeans, would make the Vikings quite versatile travelers. While Scandinavia was outclassing the rest of the world in the seafaring skill tree, their land situation differed from Europe's post-Roman migratory reshuffle. Instead of kingdoms full of cities and shiny monasteries, Scandinavians lived on small farmsteads and had no overarching government. But who needs government when you have a boat full of warriors in the favor of Thor? So, by the 700s, Scandinavians were becoming familiar with the wider European world, sailing eastwards in the Baltic and hopping westwards to the Frisian coast. This trading was sometimes a little aggressive, on the order of buy these furs or so help me Tyr, I will axe you. But that's just piracy for you, and it worked out decently well. However, the Vikings set themselves apart by just going for it. Northern Europe and the British Isles happened to have some shiny monasteries stacked with treasure and utterly lacking any defenses, because who would be so craven as to plunder a monastery? Well, that Pollyanna delusion shattered like a stained glass window when the Vikings rolled up to the British island of Lindisfarne in 793 and trampled the place, stealing the artifacts and selling the monks they didn't kill into slavery. Because, as they soon found out, the Muslim world was incalculably rich and had a substantial market for slave imports. Christians weren't supposed to be in the slaving business, but the markets in Frisia, Rome, Venice, and Constantinople clearly weren't losing any sleep about it. Oh, Cleo, what are you yelling about? No, slavery's bad. Here. Oh, good cat, good cat. It's you. So the Vikings of the early 800s enjoyed a stunningly efficient business model. Sail, sack, steal, sell, celebrate. And the Europeans were horrified. This, dear viewer, is why some of our sources for the Vikings are so uniquely screwed. Scandinavians left some inscriptions on runestones, but otherwise didn't write anything about themselves during the Viking Age, so our documentation comes from the people who lived in constant fear of being waylaid by a surprise fleet of longships. Now, as a human with functional empathy, it's obvious why these accounts are so biased, but as a historian who wishes we understood the Vikings a little bit better, it does me a big sad. We do eventually get Scandinavian sources on their history and culture, but they're about 3 centuries late, and were all written post-Christianization, so we're over to our original Norse works. And this is where archaeology especially has come in clutch for us, because settlement remains and burial patterns across Europe have been doing the heavy lifting in recent scholarship. As it happens, our newest discoveries are coming from Eastern Europe, which had long been sidelined in the Viking narrative and was an inaccessible to research because of that pesky Iron Curtain. Yeah, I know, there were bigger problems in the 20th century, but Viking stuff, man, come on. Anyway, the earliest evidence we have for the Eurasian trade routine comes from the system of waterways running from the Baltic down the Volga and to the Caspian Sea. The swindle here wasn't in sacking monasteries because there weren't any, but in trading furs, lumber, amber, and wool, plus capturing local Slavic people and selling them into slavery. The morality of that last operation was rather bankrupt, but the economics were quite the opposite. The only problem is Vikings had to work with middlemen in the Bulgar and Khazar cognates. So in the mid-800s, they moved westwards, making the Volga River and onto the Dnieper. This route fed into the Black Sea and landed them right on the doorstep of the biggest and shiniest city in the Christian world, Constantinople. This being the Vikings, they tried to sack it, but the Byzantines had the benefit of actual defenses and were able to hold out just fine. They did, however, become fascinated by the Vikings, whom they called Varangians, and hired some for the emperor's personal guard. Scandinavians were thrilled to deal directly with Constantinople and built up trading towns along the Dnieper River, such as Kiev. The demographics at work here are a little murky because it seems like the Scandinavians of the so-called Rus became a minority population among the native Slavs and Finns, but research is ongoing. To the collective thrill of the Byzantine Empire, the Rus adopted Orthodox Christianity in 989, and this becomes a running plotline elsewhere in Europe. So let's jump west and look at the Carolingian Empire. After some raiding in the early 800s, the Vikings figure out that they can make significantly more cash from gently sacking a place and then ransoming the meat and captives back to the locals. They also start exploiting entire cities for payment to the Daimgeld in exchange for not attacking. This process was made significantly easier by the near-constant civil war between the three Frankish kingdoms after its partition in 840, so there was zero coordinating resistance to the raids. By 865, the Vikings had cleared out Central Europe a little too well, so many hopped the channel to go bother the Isles instead. We'll go ravage England in a second, don't you worry, but at the turn of the 10th century, our beloved Northmen doubled back over to France, and the Frankish king was flat broke, so he paid them off with land. The Vikings gained the county of Rouen, which was later promoted to the Duchy of Normandy. This was great for everyone because the Vikings stopped sailing down the Seine to make a mess in Paris, and the newly settled Normans got comfy in their new digs, speaking French, adopting Christianity, and cooperating with the church administration to more effectively govern. The Normans quickly stop acting like your typical Vikings and go off on their own historical trajectory, but safe to say they become a big deal. Okay, so now let's destroy the British Isles. In the early 800s, they were prime targets. Kingdoms were small and weak, and Irish monks prepared a buffet of beautifully sackable monasteries. We had the standard Viking playbook until 865, when the Great Army arrived from Francia, Denmark, and Norway to absolutely wreck shop. In the span of a few years, a Scandinavian army makes a base in East Anglia, marches north to conquer York and the Kingdom of Northumbria, swoops down to take half of Mercia, and loops back over to East Anglia to make it over half of the Saxon kingdom stomped, the only full survivor being Wessex. Unlike in Normandy, the Vikings weren't able to establish a proper state, but they did set the rulebook for this big new land, so we call it the Danelaw. Meanwhile, back in Wessex, King Alfred knew that it was nut up or shut up, so he reformed his state to meet the Scandinavian threat, and his successors later conquered up to create the Kingdom of England. And the Anglo-Danish hybrid culture in the north seemed pretty chill with the arrangement, what with all the easily arable land and good royal administration. Then there's Ireland, which didn't end up being a place where Scandinavians came to live, but it did become the money pot of the Viking world. Because after they cleaned out the countless monasteries, they built up coastal merchant towns at the bases of rivers to raid inland for slaves to sell at markets in Spain. Of course, they raided some Iberian towns along the way, but what do you expect? Norse settlers had more long-term luck in the wider Celtic worlds, like the Isle of Man, the Hebrides, Orkneys, Shetlands, and lowland Scotland. But if we want to talk about settlement colonization, we've got to go off the edge of the known world for the A-tier Viking accomplishment. Iceland. Situated smack in the middle of the North Atlantic, Iceland is a little out of the way and seems to have been discovered by accident, when some poor sailors overshot the Faroe Islands and presumably freaked the hell out when they discovered a giant uninhabited island about 2 postcodes out from Niflheim. Setting aside the non-zero chance of veering wildly off course while sailing over, it's easy to see why Iceland instantly became prime real estate. Tons of good land, no locals to fight, and the Valkyries put on a light show every winter. Dinner and a show, what else do you need? After Iceland's discovery in the 870s-ish, fleets of Norwegians sail in to settle and create a quasi-democratic island assembly. As centuries go by, it remains a fairly insular corner of the Scandinavian world, and the old oral storytelling tradition gets put to writing, resulting in one of the most stacked literary cultures anywhere. The myths and historical sagas that we have aren't perfect, history is embellished, and mythology is through a post-Christian lens, but they're still the source for our understanding of Viking Age culture. So, as we've seen, the Scandinavian diaspora covered pretty much everywhere, but the Viking Age itself eventually wrapped up.
Hey Blue, this next part is insanely complicated. Mind if I step in?
Oh my word! Friend of the channel, Yellow, aka Ludo History.
That's me.
You, my good sir, have 2 whole degrees in this field, which means on average, we each have 1 degree in this field.
That's definitely not how math works.
Oh, I studied classics. Red's the one with the math degree.
Don't you dare bring me into this.
Yellow, why don't you take it from here?
So Christianity was interacting in much more interesting ways than mere victimhood in the Viking Age. It's not like most people had no clue what this Christianity was. Traders had been marked with the sign of the cross from early on, full-scale missionary attempts had happened as early as the 820s, and readers in Europe would convert, sometimes even voluntarily. But the big wave of conversions among the Scandinavian elite happens in the late 10th century. Now, you'd think this was top grades, but you'd be wrong. Knut the Great was baptized in 1014, and he gets the distinction of most successful Viking, actually from the King of England in 1060. And Ted, the patron saint of Norway, was a mercenary invader in England in the 1010s too. So you can't exactly call conversion ended. Christianity is linked to the end of the Viking Age is even more tenuous in the Balkans. Sweden and Denmark kept raiding there well into the 12th century, though they eventually justified it as a crusade. What Christianity did do is that local leaders used Christian models and tools, such as the tithe, to justify and consolidate their power. Doing so allowed for more centralization than was possible before, and models of sacral kingship assisted in state building in Scandinavia and the formation of the countries into very roughly the shapes they have today. This is a slow process though. It wasn't like 1066 hit and they went, we're now well-behaved Christian kingdoms. In fact, I'm running out of time. Nailed it.
Whoopsies, that's the late medieval alarm, which means that if we go any further, I'm going to start compulsively talking about Florence, so let's wrap it up here. Thanks so much for stopping by, Yellow. So it's clearly hard to put a firm end date on the Viking Age, because the methods, motivations, and goals all changed during that time, but 1066 does have a nice irony to it. King Harold of Norway tried to conquer England using some classic great army tactics, but was defeated in battle. But then, 1 month later, Duke William of Normandy led an army of knights at Hastings and won himself a kingdom. The Scandinavians who plagued by the old rules were left out in the cold, and the Scandinavians who adapted to their new homes and to changing worlds did a lot better for themselves. So, all told, the Viking Age is a class above simple piracy because it effectively terraformed the landscape of European politics, economics, and culture. And though their legacy has been appropriated in ways ranging from dubious to flat-out dangerous, the Viking Age proves that history only gets cooler the more we learn about it. Thank you so much for watching, and special thanks to Yellow for both helping out with the script and jumping in to talk about the lengthy denouement of the Viking Age. You can see Yellow analyzing the historical chops of popular video games over on Twitch TV/Ludo History, and as always, thank you to the patrons who make this show possible. See you all in the next video.
Singing eyes and fingers drew me loving to your eyes.
so skilled, so hard-working, so ingenious. Speaking of hard work, one of the things we're going to be doing in this film is following the creation of an Anglo-Saxon jewel from start to finish.
I won't take nothing less than a deeper
Later on,
love.
I'll introduce you properly to Sean Greenhatch here. For now, all that really matters is that he's going to be making something exquisite. A silver disc brooch in the Anglo-Saxon manner.
Sean Greenhatch's Anglo-Saxon brooch is a pleasure we're relate. First, we need to confront the North's most notorious barbarians. We've tackled some terrifying warrior nations in this series.
You'll always be the one to give me everything.
Gods. But when it comes
Just
to
when I thought
killing
no one
us,
cared.
no one has quite as fearsome a reputation as the Vikings.
Lift my spirits high. Come on and rescue me.
People get so much wrong about the Vikings. They didn't wear these ridiculous helmets for a start. These were invented in the 19th century by a stage designer working on a Wagner opera. He had to make one of the singing Vikings look particularly evil. So he stuck the devil's horns on a helmet. And the Vikings have been lumbered with these helmets ever since.
This is what the helmets really look like. The only surviving Viking helmet in the National Museum.
The Vikings were particularly interesting because while all the other Germanic tribes headed south and became thoroughly Italianate, the Vikings stayed in the harsh and windy north, where they clung to the old ways. So they were a barbarian nation of a pure and exciting type.
The Vikings were a living link to an older and deeper European past. There were forces at work in them that civilization hadn't dimmed. And that's what's so exciting.
Most of the time they were simple farmers, tending the land, keeping livestock, growing what they could. But in the lands of the Vikings, we can't go very far without encountering water. And this constant presence of the sea has turned them into superb sailors. Exactly where they reached is still fiercely debated, but they certainly got to Greenland and then to Newfoundland. The Vikings discovered America a long, long time before Columbus. So, boatmanship was one of their great achievements, and another of their great achievements was art.
In the great years of Viking expansion, roughly 800 AD to roughly 1100 AD, the Vikings put almost as much energy into making their own art as they did into stealing other people's. This trefoil Viking brooch was modelled on the buckles used by Roman soldiers on their sword belts. The Vikings adapted it and turned it into a brooch for ladies. Much of what they made is so intricate and fine, it's difficult to see. So to make absolutely clear what adventurous creatives they were, I brought you to Oslo, to one of the great Viking museums, where I wanted to show you this whopping great nautical masterpiece.
On 8th of August 1903, a Norwegian farmer called Knut Rom knocked on the door of Professor Gabriel Gustafsson of the Museum of Antiquities here in Oslo. While digging on his farm, said Knut Rom, he'd come across a buried ship, and he thought it might be Viking. 2 days later,
anyone ever says to you the Vikings were barbarous, grab them by the ear and take them here to Oslo. Runes. More runes. And still more runes. All over Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, and particularly here in Sweden, you find these magnificent standing stones left behind by the Vikings, covered in wobbly carvings. Runes are the bits of writing on a twisted slate. You usually find them on Viking gravestones. These ones here say, "Give your love a husband." Remember, eventually the runes fell into his hands and revealed themselves. Odin passed them to us. Thus, from the start, the runes were associated with magic and the mysteries of the cosmos. This splendid story about Odin up in the trees and the origin of the runes is another example of the extraordinary power that words had in these fateful years. Words, letters, symbols seemed to mean so much in the Dark Ages. They were so loaded, they had such resonance. Shape here, that's a V sound, and that's an A, L, and so on. So that says Valdemar. And in fact, this whole message is, here stands Valdemar in Viking land. The runic alphabet, or Futhark as it's called, had 24 letters in it originally. Later on, when the Vikings attacked Britain, they took the runes with them, and the Futhark grew to 33 letters. The new letters were needed to describe new sounds. Every time the Vikings conquered a new territory and new words entered their language, they needed new letters to describe them. So, for example, originally there was no W, and I have to use a V sound for my name, Valdemar. So the runes were never some cobweb-covered dead language fit only for a museum. They were always alive, vibrant, and constantly
us that the Yelling Stone was put here by Harold Bluetooth, the energetic Viking ruler who's usually credited with converting the Danes to Christianity. I am Harold, says here, son of Gorm, and I made the Danes Christians. It's carved on all three sides. On this side, it's an image of a giant snake attacking a stylized lion. Obviously there are no lions in Scandinavia. It's an image they found abroad. But the Vikings identified with the lions.
Let yourself go and enjoy the bass fly.
It's an image